Hello everyone, and welcome to the Tome of Silver, the show where I randomly select a game from my collection, review it, and add it to an ever-growing ranking list. The late 1990s was a rough time for Marvel Comics. Sales were starting to decline across the board, and Marvel's strict sticking to continuity not only meant new writers had decades worth of previous comics to consider when writing a new story, but it simultaneously made it intimidating for new readers to jump in. In an attempt to appeal to new teen readers, the idea for the Ultimate line of Marvel Comics was created. Marvel Ultimate consisted of various series of comics that took place in an alternate universe to the mainline Marvel Comics, allowing for fresh new stories to be told with familiar characters. The first of these new series in Marvel Ultimate was Ultimate Spider-Man, released in the year 2000, telling a similar yet different story of Peter Parker. At its core, it was still a story about a nerdy kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider, fighting crime while trying to live a normal teenage life. However, Ultimate Spider-Man had new iterations of the Wall Crawler's famous Rogues Gallery, while presenting original storylines to shake up what readers had come to expect of classic Spider-Man comics. Ultimate Spider-Man was a huge success, selling over 20 million copies and with critics applauding this new take on the iconic hero. In 2005, a video game based on these comics was released, simply titled Ultimate Spider-Man, and interestingly, the game would not only allow us to play as the titular webhead, but also his popular nemesis, Venom, with the story taking place 3 months after the Venom arc in the Ultimate comics. Ultimate Spider-Man had a few different versions, a console version being released on PlayStation 2, Xbox, Microsoft Windows, and GameCube, a 2.5D platformer being released for the Nintendo DS, and a straight 2D platformer being released for the Gameboy Advance. So we actually have a bit of a double feature today, as I will not only be taking a look at the GameCube version of the game, but the Gameboy Advance version as well, as I actually owned the GBA version way before I ever got the console version. Unfortunately, I have neither owned nor played the DS version, so we will not be covering it in today's video. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed this dual retrospective. So without further ado, attach your web shooters, feed your symbiote with the lives of the innocent, and let's turn the page to Ultimate Spider-Man. Let's start off with the console version. In the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Peter and Eddie Brock, rather than being rival reporters at the Daily Bugle, are childhood friends. Additionally, rather than being a creature from outer space, the Venom symbiote is actually a creation of Peter and Eddie's fathers in an attempt to cure cancer, before they died in a plane crash. Before their deaths, they mistakenly signed the suit over to Trask Industries, a company hoping to use the suit for military purposes. Spidey attempts to steal the suit back, only to get the suit on him. Though initially making Spider-Man feel powerful, he quickly discovers the suit is actually feeding on him, leading to him desperately separating himself from the symbiote. Finding out what Peter tried to do, and learning that he's Spider-Man, Eddie becomes enraged, taking the suit for himself and becoming the hulking monster known as Venom. Peter and Eddie have a fight on their school campus, leading to Eddie in the suit seemingly being killed. 3 months later, Peter is trying to live his normal teenage life, when he starts to investigate Trask Industries and their connection to his and Eddie's fathers. Meanwhile, Eddie, surviving the fight with Spider-Man earlier, is being hunted down by Trask Industries and the mercenary Silver Sable, who wishes to take back the black suit. All the while, the symbiote is slowly eating Eddie alive, meaning the only way he can survive is by going out and feeding on the lives of other people. Rather than telling a typical Spider-Man story of a villain wanting to take over the city, Ultimate Spider-Man opts to tell a more focused, personal story about the conflict between Spider-Man and Venom. The contrast between the protagonist storylines, with the regular lighthearted heroics of Spider-Man and the darker, more violent actions of Venom, make each character's storyline feel distinct from one another, getting the player invested in both characters and their motivations. I never felt disappointed when the story switched me from Venom to Spidey, or vice versa, as I was equally invested in the goals and struggles of both protagonists. As the player gets invested in both characters' storylines, it makes it all the more exciting when these two begin to cross paths more and more, and gives the game's finale, where both stories fully converge with each other for one final climactic showdown, a massive payoff. A smaller scale yet personal story like this was so rare for Spider-Man games back in the day, and it makes Ultimate Spider-Man stand out among a sea of relatively basic Spider-Man tales in video games. The relationship between Ultimate Spidey and Venom is genuinely intriguing, easily one of the best elements of this game. It's for that reason that it's unfortunate the game doesn't always keep a proper focus on that relationship. About halfway through the game, there are a number of levels that have little to nothing to do with the conflict between Spidey and Venom. Moments such as the fight with the Goblin and both encounters with Beetle came off as filler to pad out the game's runtime. It seemed like the point of these missions was to set up some sort of sequel, with Beetle getting a sample of the Venom symbiote and not being seen again for the rest of the game. But since the sequel never came to be, it instead leaves these levels seeming like a waste of time, and takes away from the core plot. And these segments take up most of the middle of the story, so as I'm getting hooked on Spider-Man and Venom slowly setting their sights on Trask Industries, I'm suddenly told to stop caring about it to focus on something unrelated, and the overall story is much weaker for it. The game's ending also sneaks up on you very quickly. The final few chapters are appropriately grandiose and fitting of a finale, but it didn't seem like anything significant enough happened beforehand to trigger this grand finale, leaving me feel like the lead up into the endgame was rushed a bit. All in all, the story has some really cool moments, but it speeds by too quickly to be as memorable as it could, and the segments unrelated to the plot don't help create a cohesive narrative. I will say that the way the game is presented is really cool, with cutscenes appearing in comic panels with onomatopoeias being used for sound effects. Ultimate Spider-Man also uses a sharp cel-shading art style made to resemble the Ultimate comics the game is based on. This art style combines very well with the comic panel cutscenes to really make the game feel like a comic come to life, giving Ultimate Spider-Man a distinct style when compared to other Spider-Man games that came before it. A weaker part of the game's presentation is its voice acting. Most of it is passable, but I personally found Spider-Man's voice actor to be rather annoying. The voice fits Peter being 15 years old, but most of his delivery comes across as scratchy and whiny, and given how much Spider-Man talks, it's a key part of his character after all, it really grated on me after a while.
Ah! The best bone's connected to the base bone! How's it feel to get your butt kicked by a 15-year-old kid? What does that mean?
It means I need you to back off.
Yeah, okay, fine. But this is my life. Don't come here. I'm so scared I can't even finish my lame joke.
Gameplay-wise, you play as both Spider-Man and Venom throughout the story, though you're only allowed to explore the city outside of missions as Spider-Man until you beat the game. Spider-Man plays much how we've come to expect. In combat, Spidey has some pretty basic punch and kick combos, as well as a few air attacks you can perform. You can also web up enemies to momentarily stun them or throw them around. When playing as Spider-Man, after knocking an enemy down, you'll need to web them up again before a certain amount of time passes, or else the enemy will get back up again with full health. Combat with Spider-Man is fairly basic and unremarkable. There's a very limited amount of combos you can do, making fights become rather repetitive pretty quickly. I do like that if you're fighting enemies near a wall, Spider-Man will use those walls to jump around and perform attacks, making for a nice bit of visual variety, and a proper display of Spider-Man's more acrobatic combat style. It's purely for visual effect though, so you don't really get to control it. But the combat isn't really what most Spider-Man fans are eager to do, it's the web swinging, and I'm happy to report that Ultimate Spider-Man's swinging is tons of fun. Much of the web swinging was built off of the mechanics of Spider-Man 2, meaning Spidey's webs need to attach to a building to be able to swing. You can also hit both shoulder buttons together to perform a web zip, where Spider-Man will shoot a line of web quickly to pull himself forward, which I found was great for giving myself a quick burst of speed or whenever I needed to make a sharp turn around buildings during some of the game's chase sequences. The web swinging also relies quite a bit on momentum, with full swings letting the player jump further and faster, making zipping along the game's fully explorable rendition of Queens and Manhattan feel fun and rewarding. All in all, playing as the wall crawler is a good time, but the combat could have used a bit more variety. Our second playable character, however, Venom, is his own unique beast, and is easily the highlight of the whole game. Where Spider-Man's gameplay is focused on grace and acrobatics, Venom has a much greater focus on power and destruction. As Venom, you'll be wreaking havoc across the city while throwing cars and taking down waves of heavily armed soldiers, demonstrating the clear difference between him and his red and blue counterpart. You can attack with standard punches, hit wide areas with his tendrils, and toss enemies around like ragdolls. Unlike in the standard universe, Ultimate Venom cannot web swing. Instead, the game allows the player to leap incredibly high in the air and travel long distances. Though nothing can quite beat the sensation of swinging on webs, these massive leaps are almost just as fun of a way to travel across the city. You may think that with how powerful Venom is, his gameplay may be on the easier side. However, due to the symbiote slowly eating away at Eddie, your health will drain away over the course of a given level. The only way to get your health back up is to feed on other people, with armed enemies healing a bit of health, while innocent civilians running away can heal massive portions. This mechanic adds a nice bit of tension to the gameplay, letting you fight as a one-man army while not letting you get too carried away, lest your HP drop too quickly. Ultimate Spider-Man does an excellent job making both characters feel unique from each other while still being incredibly fun to play for their own reasons, a feat that I find to be very commendable. One of the weaker aspects of the game is unfortunately the boss fights. On one hand, I do appreciate the challenge most of these fights posed. The boss's attacks do a hefty amount of damage, forcing me to make each dodge I made count, and needing me to pick and choose the right time to strike. However, the amount of damage these bosses dealt compared to how little they took felt disproportionate, and as long as the boss got a few good pot shots in every now and again, the fight would end in my defeat. This led to most boss fights devolving into jumping into the air, attacking, running away, and then waiting for another opening, rinse and repeat. This was not particularly fun, and was just repetitive, but it was the most comfortable way of dealing with these fights rather than playing the game normally. That said, I did like seeing some of the ultimate versions of classic Spider-Man villains, as it can be cool seeing the differences between them and their original counterparts. Like Electro being able to become pure electricity, or the Goblin being a much larger foe with pyrokinetic abilities. Ultimate Spider-Man is not particularly long, as you can beat the main story in a little under 6 hours, but to the game's credit, it does have a decent amount of things to do outside of the story. The game encourages exploration around the city, as you can find various tokens scattered about. Some of these tokens unlock comic covers of Ultimate Spider-Man comics, allowing you to take a trip through a small bit of Ultimate Spider-Man history and admire the really cool art covers Ultimate Spider-Man had. Other tokens will allow you to unlock alternative costumes for Spider-Man, though I did find the selection here was pretty weak, and I didn't have too much desire to unlock them. There are also various crimes you can stop, races you can do, and combat tours where you go around the city beating up criminals. Once finishing the game, you'll be able to switch from Spider-Man to Venom on the fly, letting you explore around the city as Venom. Venom has his own races he can do, taking advantage of his unique form of mobility, but the real highlight happens once you start attacking people and throwing cars. As you do, a score will appear at the top of the screen, and a minigame of sorts will begin. It will start off with basic enemies coming to attack you, but as you defeat more enemies and cause more destruction, a meter at the bottom will start to fill up, slowly sending increasingly escalating enemies your way. Think the wanted system from Grand Theft Auto of all things. You can play this mode whenever you want and try and get a high score, which was very enjoyable. My last bit of praise is that Ultimate Spider-Man has a really great soundtrack, with a lot of dark sounding electronic pieces, which I felt did a good job setting up the darker tone of the game's narrative. The console version of Ultimate Spider-Man is a very good game, but I do have some nitpicks which brought down the experience for me. First, as you progress through the story missions, the next mission won't be immediately available. Instead, you'll need to have completed a certain amount of races, combat tours, and various crimes throughout the city in order to unlock the next part of the story. I found this was a miserable way of going about encouraging players to do the side content. The game already has unlockable costumes tied to doing these side objectives, which should be incentive enough. You don't need to do a ludicrous amount of these objectives to continue the story, but it grinded the momentum of the story to a halt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the developers made them mandatory just to pad out the game's already short runtime. Secondly, the game is way too reliant on chase sequences. Missions where you need to stay on a character's trail without getting too far behind were too numerous, and while I didn't dislike them on their own, the amount the game throws at you, especially at the latter half of the game, became tedious. These chase sequences don't have much in the way of checkpoints either. While it's not so bad in the early game, the final few chases and the early one with Electro last way too long, and having to restart what felt like 5 minutes of chasing because I slipped up a bit really started to wane on me. Finally, I had a few performance issues with the GameCube version, where at random times the game would momentarily freeze before continuing. This stuttering killed the flow of some of the game's more fast-paced sequences. I'm not certain how the other console versions fare in comparison, but I suspect the performance issues likely stem from the game having to load in a full city with cars and objectives. These moments of stuttering aren't game-breaking, but are definitely a noticeable blemish. Ordinarily, this would be the part where I add the game to the ranking. However, we're not done with Ultimate Spider-Man quite yet, as we'll now be turning our attention to the GBA release. I want to confess that I carry a lot of nostalgia for this version of the game. This was one of those games that played an important role in my childhood, not only being one of my most played games as a kid, but also being my first major introduction to Spider-Man. As such, be warned that my nostalgia may inadvertently play up my thoughts on this game. With all that said, upon the more recent playthrough while viewing it with a more critical lens, man, this game is still really good. The GBA version of Ultimate Spider-Man is a 2D platformer, consisting of 7 chapters, each with 3 stages. Here we have a similar story to its console counterpart, with Peter trying to find the truth behind the death of his and Eddie's parents, while Eddie tries to get control of the suit while being hunted down by Silver Sable. However, I actually think the way the GBA version tells the story is better than the console version. Sure, the GBA version doesn't have the slick comic book cutscenes as the console versions, and the story is definitely shorter, but its short length means it doesn't have those strange, unrelated story moments with the Goblin or the Beetle. The story is strictly about the conflict between Spider-Man, Venom, and Trask, which made for a much tighter and better told narrative. Just as before, you get to play as Spider-Man and Venom. Spider-Man has various punches and kicks you can switch between to beat up thugs, can swing, climb on walls, web zip to various points, and web up enemies to momentarily immobilize them. Basically, you can do anything you could on the console version, but adjusted for the 2D setting. Unlike the console version, Spidey has a limited amount of webbing he can use, which can only be restored through blue pickups. But honestly, you're unlikely to run out over the course of the game, so it's not a huge deal, to the point where this mechanic probably didn't need to be in the game to begin with. Meanwhile, Venom maintains his slowly draining HP, as well as his ability to feed on enemies. However, unlike the console version, you cannot feed on enemies at any time. Instead, you need to lower their HP until you see it change from orange to blue. Trying to feed on enemies who have an orange HP will instead momentarily stun them, which can actually be really useful in its own right if you're dealing with multiple enemies at once. I gotta say, you would think this being a GBA release of a console game, that it would feel like a cash grab, haphazardly put together, but that's really not the case. It does an excellent job translating the distinct gameplay style of the 2 protagonists to a 2D format, and the controls for each character felt really snappy and fluid, making for some really smooth gameplay. Another praise I have for the game is it encourages exploration in each level, as each stage has an upgrade you can find for Spider-Man and Venom, like extra web fluid and new combat moves for Spidey, or faster feeding and making your HP stop draining by a certain point for Venom. These upgrades are all pretty useful, making them worth finding and encourages replaying the stage carefully if you didn't find them the first go around. Gameplay-wise, my only real complaint is that, just like the console versions, the boss fights are pretty weak, as you just need to knock down the boss, take a few steps back to avoid their getting up attack, hit them with another combo to knock them down, so on and so forth. They lack any real challenge or any strategy to make these bosses anything of note. The game is pretty short too. Assuming you find all the upgrades on your first go, you can beat the game in about 2 hours. Once you beat the game, you unlock Challenge Mode, which for all intents and purposes is the same game but with enemies switched around for tougher ones, making for a slightly harder experience. As far as I could tell, you don't take more damage or deal less damage to enemies either, it just changes what enemy types appear. This mode is nothing worth replaying the game immediately for, it just offers a tougher experience for those who want it. Besides that, this game doesn't have anything else in terms of content, making for a really short overall experience. As mentioned earlier, Ultimate Spider-Man for the GBA lacks the sharp comics-to-life visuals the console versions have, but the sprite work is still pretty good. Characters and interactable objects are rendered in 3D, while the background resembles 2D drawings. The contrast between these two styles works to the game's benefit, making it easy to track what are important objects or simply background elements. The sprites for the 3D elements, especially for Venom and Spidey, are all very fluid too, animating really well for a Game Boy title. And as a little bonus, a bit of those comic book elements can still be seen in the game's level menus too, which is appreciated. The visuals for the cutscenes, meanwhile, use images that do resemble the cel shading style of the console versions, and in some cases, the visuals here actually help tell the story better than the console version. For example, at the beginning of the story, the reason why Peter thought Eddie died was because Eddie was electrocuted. In the console version, this doesn't come across very well. Here, Cop starts shooting at Venom, making him step back onto an electrified wire. But we don't see what happens to Venom after stepping on it. Does he collapse? Does the electricity make him explode? We don't really know, as after seeing Venom getting shocked, the cutscene cuts to 3 months later, making it unclear how Peter could have thought Eddie died. Meanwhile, the visuals for the Gameboy Advance version shows that the electric shock that hits Venom was powerful enough that it looks like Venom got completely vaporized, making it very clear how Eddie would be assumed dead. So hats off to the artists who made these images for the cutscenes, they did a great job. The last element to talk about for the GBA version is the game's music, and honestly this music is good, really good, to the point where I actually think this game has one of my favorite soundtracks of any Game Boy title I have ever played. It's filled to burst with these tense, dark sounding electronic tracks that I love, and it fits the game's tone so well. Overall, both versions of Ultimate Spider-Man are solid experiences. The console version boasts an excellent art style, with fun, free-roaming gameplay that's held back by moments both in terms of its story and gameplay that feel like padding. Meanwhile, the GBA version doesn't really do anything exceptional, but offers a short yet all-around great 2D platformer with some truly great music. No matter which version of the game you decide to play, you will be given a unique yet satisfying experience with the red and blue web-slinger and his symbiotic nemesis. And so, the GameCube version of Ultimate Spider-Man will take a respectable place at the number 15 spot. While likely upsetting to some, its handheld counterpart will sling a bit higher to the number 12 spot. Yes, I know, my nostalgia is probably making the Game Boy version seem better than it is, but what can I say? Nearly 15 years later, the Game Boy version is still a game I think about, still listen to the music, and had an important role in making me such a huge fan of comics today. As such, I have to give the Game Boy version the edge. What do y'all think about Ultimate Spider-Man? Do you have a preference between the console and Game Boy versions? And actually, if you've played the DS version, is that version worth playing at all? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Next time, we'll be turning our heads to the Nintendo DS, with a game that lets you collect a bunch of unique creatures to level them up and make them stronger. That's right, we're going back to what? Oh, that's not a Pokemon game. Guess we'll be looking at a different Monster Collection game next video. Please look forward to that. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and may we see each other again when we turn to the next chapter in the Tome of Silver.